Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you, worship team, for leading us in those hymns. For that story that you shared, Jan, about the story behind the song, or the inspiration behind the song. What a friend we have in Jesus. It's oftentimes through great trials that we discover the goodness of God and what a friend Jesus truly is. And the book of Job really focuses in on that point, that there can't be true triumph in knowing who God is unless there's real trials. We learn through these experiences of life that oftentimes are very difficult to deal with. And so, as recorded in the book of Job, we read it in the first two chapters, just how much Job goes through, and the difficulties, the tests that he experiences, and he has to deal with. And in some way, shape, or form, we can all identify with pain, sorrow, and sadness, and loss. And so this morning, I just want to, as we're looking through the book of Job, I want us to be reminded of the advice and the counsel that we can be the beneficiaries of, or that in God's grace and in His will, we can benefit others with words of counsel. And so this morning, that's my prayer, is that we'll leave here having a better understanding of what it means to provide godly advice and counsel. And I believe that even the ladies in their Bible studies on Monday were looking at Psalm 1 and how important counsel is, in a positive way, but in a negative way as well. I'm reminded of the two beggars, they were both broke and destitute, were sitting on a park bench. One said, "I'm a man who never took advice from anybody." The other beggar said, "Shake, old buddy, I'm a man who followed everybody's advice." So if we're not selective in choosing our counselors, it could direct us towards a ruin and lead us towards ruin. I had some advice in my day, and for many of us, we could say our moms gave us the best advice. My mom gave me advice on a variety of issues. On religion, her advice was, "You better pray that comes out of the carpet." I thanked her for that advice. She had advice on medicine. "If you don't stop crossing your eyes, they're going to freeze that way." She even had advice on the circus and contortionism. "Will you look at the dirt on the back of your neck?" That wasn't an easy thing to do. And of course, she had advice on genetics. She said, "You're just like your father." Oftentimes. Yes, the advice that we receive, oftentimes it's good, oftentimes it's not so good, sometimes it's necessary, and other times it's not so necessary. But as on a more serious note, we look at the first couple of chapters of Job, we see that advice came his way, whether he wanted it or not. Thank you, Warren, for reading the scriptures and reading the service. And if we can just start off looking at Job chapter 3. Last week we considered Job and the choice that he made not to curse God and die. Well, why would he curse God? Well, can you imagine everything that he owned, all of his possessions, his fortune was gone. His family, those who were nearest and dearest to him, were gone, were taken from him. And his physical well-being, it was taken from him. That he had sores from the crown of his head to the heel of his feet. So he was in dire straits. He was in a difficult situation. He did not curse God and die. But if we begin reading at verse 1 of chapter 3, after this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. He said, "May the day of my birth perish, and the night that said, a boy is conceived. That day may turn to darkness. May God above not care about it. May no light shine on it. May gloom and utter darkness claim it once more. May a cloud settle over it. May blackness overwhelm it. That night may thick darkness seize it. May it not be included among the days of the year, nor be entered in any of the months. May that night be barren. May no shout of joy be heard in it." So this is what, oftentimes we say happy birthday. Job doesn't want to hear that song right now. May those who curse days curse that day. Those who are ready to rouse the Leviathan, that's a sea monster. May its morning stars become dark. May it wait for daylight in vain and not see the first rays of dawn. For it did not shut the doors of the womb on me to hide trouble from my eyes. And now what inevitably happens when one is going through tremendous turmoil and tragedy and strife and sorrow, the questions start, the why questions. So for the rest of the chapter, we read at least 5 whys. Why in verse 12? Why in verse 16? Why in verse 20? And why in verse 23? Why is life given to a man whose way is hidden, who God has hedged in? For sighing, it says, Job says in verse 24, has become my daily food. My groans pour out like water. What I have feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me. You know when people think the worst and it actually happens, and they sense there's some type of incredible prophetic statement or thought that they had, and it actually occurred, you'd be surprised how often we think of wrong things, of bad things. And once in a while they occur, so then we say, it's funny, I was thinking that this morning, as if it's big prophetic thought. But actually, we think of things because of our frailty and our sinful, sorrowful state. We do oftentimes think, it's common to us, all of us. We think we have worries that what would happen about my financial situation, or my family, or myself physically. It's not uncommon to have negative thoughts in those areas. And then when they happen, we think it's a great big thought that was personal to us, that was somehow prophetic. But don't be surprised that even Job, who was blameless and upright, could have these thoughts. So can you and I, and more frequently than you would think of others having these thoughts. And finally, the conclusion of this chapter, I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, but only turmoil. End of chapter. Thank the Lord it's not the end of the book or the end of Job's life. But it is a time that he's going through, and it's a difficult time that he's going through. Proverbs says, the way of a fool seems right to him, but a wise man listens to advice. Proverbs chapter 19 says, listen to advice and accept instruction, and in the end you will be wise. So we can be encouraged that for whatever reason God has chosen to use us, His human instruments, His people, to minister to His people. And we're going to be reminded that it's not so easily accomplished. So we're going to take a few lessons that we've learned through Job's counselors, and maybe we can make application ourselves. But before we go any further, let us just have a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for your goodness to us. We thank you for how you've blessed us. Lord, we're reminded that there are so many things going on in people's lives. Maybe even for those here presently this morning. Issues of life that have just left them distraught and discouraged, downcast and depressed even. So Lord, I pray this morning that you would encourage us through your word. As you've already encouraged us through the praising of your name in song, and through the word of testimony, and through the prayers offered up on behalf of individual people who are in need of a touch from you. And we thank you for your goodness to us. Thank you for each one. Thank you for the children downstairs again. And we thank you for this time together. I do pray that I would simply be your messenger. Speak through me for your glory and honor. In Jesus' name I pray. When people are hurting, they long for answers more than ever before. But exactly at that point, the answers are harder to come by than ever before. Some of the answers never come, or some of the answers are not correct. There is, however, guidelines we can use that will be beneficial, whether we are placed in a position of offering or receiving advice. 4 principles that we should consider before we even consider advice and offering advice or taking advice is number 1, there is an enemy we encounter that we cannot see. And that was stated clearly in chapter 1. Number 2, there are trials we endure we cannot see, but they are permitted. Number 3, there is a plan we can explore that we'll not understand, but it is best. And number 4, there are consequences we experience, and the consequences we could not anticipate. So that being said, we're introduced to Job's 3 friends towards the end of chapter 2. Are you prepared? Are you prepared to offer counsel? That is the question that I ask myself when you're thrust into situations, or when you knock at the door, or you make a phone call. Am I prepared for what lies ahead? If we look at chapter 2, and we consider Job's 3 friends. When Job's 3 friends, in verse 11, Eliphaz, I call him Nophaz, the Temanite. Bildad, I call him Bildad, the Shuhite. And Zophar, I say Zophar was so far from the truth, the Namathite. Heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, Job. They set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and to comfort him. What a noble gesture and a great ideal. And to me, this was their intent. This was their intent and their desire to bring comfort and encouragement, consolation to one that was hurting. But let us be reminded, it oftentimes sounds easier to do than it is to accomplish. Why? Because the next verse tells us. When they saw him from a distance, and that being Job, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud. They tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. In other words, they thought this was going to be maybe a one-day thing. They'll go, have a visit with Job, maybe break bread, encourage him, pat on the back. Job's there, don't touch my back. It hurts. And they would be back on their way. Job would live happily ever after, and they would feel as though they accomplished God's work. But when they saw what really happened, they opened their eyes and looked from a far ways off. They couldn't believe this was the man who was the greatest in all of the land. This is the man who's upright and blameless. It shook them to their core. They were all of a sudden in no position to offer any aid or help or consolation or comfort to Job. They needed it themselves after they saw Job. The counselors needed a counselor. You see, what's most important when one is willing to step in that position of saying, I want to help, you better make sure your heart is prepared for the worst case scenario, to do the work of the Lord. It's not a speech like you hear the coaches give the players before they go onto the field or onto the ice, that little 2-minute raw speech of encouragement, and he sends them on their way, and that's all they needed. I'm reminded of the stories that I heard about the men who went off to the Great War, World War I. It was before Christmas, and they were telling their families, we'll be back for Christmas. That war that lasted 4 years, and many, many lives were lost. They didn't know what they were getting into when they first left their families and said farewell. You see, when you go to counseling, you realize that you may be going into a battlefield. And you need to have your heart prepared. You need to be praying about it, asking the Holy Spirit to give you wisdom, to give you compassion, to give you guidance. So that when you actually do approach the scene and you realize, wow, I didn't know it was this bad. What have I stepped into? A hornet's nest. Well, how am I going to respond? The greatest man of the East is now a pitiful wretch, almost beyond recognition. These men mean well, but their hearts were ill prepared. And they simply do not understand. And the more they talk, the more they make it worse. Because they're ill prepared in the first place. So that's the number one word of advice. For those of us, and I believe God has chosen all of us in some way, shape, or form. Because if you're a child of God, you're an ambassador for Jesus Christ. I'm reminded of Isaiah chapter 9. In Isaiah chapter 9 it says, the people who walk in darkness will see a great light. For those who live in a land of deep darkness will see a light. In Job's case, he was at the midnight hour of darkness. There was no light around. You see, of all the terms that could be used to describe Jesus in that prophecy in Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6, he is the eternal God, the eternal Father. He is the mighty God. He is the Prince of Peace. But what's said first in Isaiah 9:6? He is the wonderful counselor. Out of all of the things that could be said about Jesus and the prophecy about him coming into the world, it could be said, and rightfully so, and I would understand, he is the only Redeemer, and he is, but it says he is the counselor, the wonderful counselor. When I'm thinking of what it means to support, to bring comfort and encouragement, for the child of God, we know the importance of the Bible. And the question is it biblical? Individuals find solutions for their hurts and fears in Jesus and the Scriptures. And may we never forget that. With all of the pop psychology and all of the books that are available, let alone the television shows and the internet. I was reminded, I read a couple of stats, but the emphasis was people who were polled and who had went through counseling oftentimes said the best counseling just came from the normal folk person, not the professional. I don't want to downplay the importance for those who are seeking professional help. But for the child of God, we know the wonderful counselor, Jesus Christ. The one who became flesh, that word that became flesh. He has left us with his written word and that wonderful word that it is. You see, one of his friends, Eliphaz, said, "We have examined this, and it is true," in Job chapter 5 and verse 27, when they decided to open their mouths after 7 days. And the question is, who says it's truth? Eliphaz said, "We examined the matter and said this is truth." Well, in order to be able to communicate truth and understand truth, we need to know the truth. We need to know the wonderful counselor. The hardest ministry that we can be called to, in one sense, is encouraging and counseling and comforting others, because we're required to know God's word. It's more difficult than preaching the sermon to actually counsel someone. And how do we know that another person's examinations have turned up truth? Only by knowing the Word of God ourselves. And so that is the standard by which we operate. Is it biblical? Number one, are we prepared? Number two, is it biblical? And number three, as we think of counsel, as we think of Job's friends, that as they entered into his situation, is it factual? Is it factual? The outline for this point is never put both feet in your mouth at the same time, because then you have nothing to stand on. And you see, is it factual? Job's friends, Zophar, urged Job, put away sin. Eliphaz shared a similar counsel with Job in chapter 4 and verse 8 when he said, "Those who sow trouble reap it." This fellow Eliphaz may be closer to the truth in the sense that that's true. God says we reap what we sow in Galatians chapter 6. But in Job's case, it couldn't be further from the truth. It was not factual. They didn't have all of the information because they didn't know what had taken place in the heavenlies. They didn't know that Satan was the enemy who attacked Job. They just assumed that it was Job's fault. They didn't have all the facts. And so as we think of offering advice and counsel, know the facts of the case. And don't just take it for granted you do based on face value, based upon even someone else's opinion, because they may not have all the information. As well as we think of Job and his situation here, and as he's asking all of these questions, why? It's good that somebody can step in and seek to help and comfort. But we need to be careful in how we offer this advice. Let us be reminded that in this advice, we need to ask ourselves, what am I trying to accomplish? When I want to visit somebody, when I hear somebody who's going through a difficult time and I pick up the phone and I want to call them, what is my purpose? How is it teachable? You see, do you know that Job never received an answer to the question of suffering through this? He never received an answer. but he gained much insight into the nature of God. So my suggestion would be, as we provide counsel and give words and advice, let us trust that the person that we're communicating with will have a greater insight into who God is. Even if everything isn't answered, a greater insight into the nature of God and His love and His compassion and His mercy. You see, the shortest chapter in the book of Job is Job chapter 25. And as Bildad, who's speaking in that chapter, is offering advice, he says nothing that would help Job. Not a thing. Though he may say some things that are true, but he offers no helpful advice. There was no reason behind what he was saying in chapter 25. In fact, we could basically say it wasn't necessary. Sometimes the best advice is no advice, or at least very few words. Much of what was said between chapters 3 and 37, if it was really worth saying, what was really worth saying was recorded in here, and only what was worth saying, we might have 6 chapters in the book of Job. How often, when we talk with others and we counsel others, we go off on tangents, we say things, we go too far, and we go off on tangents, and we don't help in the end. Let us be reminded to keep it necessary, the things that are said, and how is it teachable? How is it teachable, and how can we encourage others to focus on God? And fifthly, does it acknowledge, when we look at Job's advisors here and his counselors, does it acknowledge the limitations of human understanding? There's something I can say very quickly and easily and honestly oftentimes when it comes to counseling, and I'm sure you can understand. I understand that I don't get it. I don't get it. It is especially important that we recognize God is not like us. Neither are His methods like ours. When God seems to step back and not answer our questions, permitting Satan to afflict His godly servant, it seems to be contrary to the God whom we talk about, the God whom we preach, the God whom we promote, and His love. And what God does in Job chapter 1, it seems totally unfair. But let us be reminded, I was reading Warren Wiersbe's book on the book of Job, and he was talking about John Wolford, and he's a great scholar. He's written several books on deep subjects such as the book of Revelation. And when he was chancellor at Dallas Seminary, he would say this to his graduating students: do not try to unscrew the inscrutability of God. What does that mean? Do not try to unscrew the inscrutability of God. Well, let us define the word inscrutability. That means not understanding. Something that is scrutable is something that we understand and we can interpret. But there are things about God that are inscrutable. And the harder we try to unscrew them, to figure it out, the worse off we get. And you see, Job's friends thought they had it all figured out as to why Job was going through this. We need to understand there are certain limitations on even the best advisors in the world. You may want them sitting right next to you for what you're going through, but even they can't figure out every issue of life. Romans chapter 11 says, "Oh, the depths of the riches, both of wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable his ways. Well, we would rather have it, how searchable are his judgments and how fathomable are his ways. But oftentimes, that's not the case. We don't know it all. Job's friends could have said, we don't understand why this is happening any more than you. God's plan is not the same for each individual. For some, his plan is Lou Gehrig's business. For others, a life of pain. For others, heartbreak and brokenness. Blindness or paralysis or congenital complications. For many, his plan is not to their request for healing. But we don't like that. Some won't accept that. In fact, they may go as far as to say, if you believe that, you lack faith. On the contrary, if you believe that, you believe in the Bible. We need to be reminded that God's ways are not our ways. Let's acknowledge human limitations. I remember in John chapter 9 that the disciples are walking by and they see a blind man and they say, why is he blind? Is it because of his sin or of his parents' sin, his father's sin? And Jesus said, neither, in neither case, but for the glory of God, for the work of God, he's blind. We need to be reminded of that we can't figure it all out this side of heaven. In our imperfections, in our frailties, in our shortcomings. Nonetheless, we're reminded to trust, to look to God. Oh, that we would come to the conclusions that Job did when he says, as the theme verse, my ears have heard of God, but now my eyes see him. Oh, that we would see the Lord in a way that we hadn't before. And finally, when we think of counsel, when we think of comforting, as they said, all they wanted to do in their initial desire was to comfort Job and to sympathize with him. Well, important, always keep your words soft and sweet, just in case you have to eat them. And that's the final point. Always keep your words soft and sweet, because you may have to eat them. Personal experience, time and time again. How often I can look back on my years and say, I remember when I used to say that. I remember when I used to believe that. Oh, I could kick myself for the number of times I offered advice that was wrong. I'm thinking, why bother? I feel like such a failure. Because it's come back on me. And maybe you can identify with that too. How often God puts up with us in our so-called know-it-all counsel and offering to others. But you know, there's one place I know that would really help me when I speak with others. Is it spoken in love? Is it spoken in love? The long-running dialogue between Job and his friends becomes more and more heated as these men struggle with the issues of suffering. Bildad takes even a cheap shot at Job's children. He says, when your children sinned against God, he gave them over to the penalty of their sin, as it says in Job chapter 80, verse 4. Taking a cheap shot at Job, attacking his children, again, it was untrue. But that's what happens when we decide to make a decision to offer comfort and encouragement, and we're so overwhelmed by it, all of a sudden we're out of our comfort zone ourselves. And we react in the flesh, and it becomes nothing more than an argument trying to prove our point. We can even say hateful things towards one another. May we be reminded that Job, in all of his sorrow and all of his sadness, God's going to intervene. God's going to intervene. But Job is going to go through a process that we can learn about in Job, in his advisors, and in his counselors. But remember, the wonderful counselor is Jesus Christ. May we look to him first and foremost when we listen to others even. Search the scriptures to see if what is being said is the truth and how can it help as we provide counsel to others. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we give thanks to you for your goodness to us. We thank you for your love and mercy. We thank you for the ways in which you've blessed us. You've blessed us with people in our lives who have been a rich blessing because they've spoken words of comfort, words of consolation and encouragement. Those in our lives you've placed, Lord, for the purpose of ministering to us and for you ministering through us to meet their needs. So we do pray, Lord, that as we've considered the life of Job and the issues of life that he went through and the struggles, may we also think of ways in which we can counsel as we've looked at those, his friends, who sought to counsel him but fell far, far short because they were ill-prepared. Lord, may we prepare our hearts. May we ask you to prepare our hearts to minister to others, to be ambassadors for Jesus Christ. For your word says, as Jesus made the promise, come to me all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly of heart, and you shall find rest unto your souls. And so Job discovered that rest much later. Lord, may we discover that rest from day to day and offer that rest to those around us. Thank you for each one here. In Jesus' name I pray.